A small presentation of myself. This is a picture from Kabul, by the way, Afghanistan. I consider myself a journalist, even if I'm moved up in the academic world. I'm also a writer of both fiction and non-fiction. I'm a traveler. You know, Norway is a very small country, 5 million people, so to understand the world, you have to get out. Professor and teacher of journalism, and also the director of a Journalism and Media International Center, which is at our institution, which has now changed name. We're called Oslo Met, or Oslo Metropolitan University. That center has a motto, connecting people across borders and connecting academics and journalists. We don't believe in these strict divisive positions between journalists and academics. We believe journalists to be intellectuals and to have expertise that many academics do not have. And I've talked to Lena in a break about our cooperation in the future, and we will consider and try, if there is any interest, to invite some of you for international courses that we have in Norway about war and peace journalism, about globalization. If there is any interest, I will try to provide scholarships for that. If, yeah, as I said, she said there would be people interested. I can see a few nodding their heads here. Let's see. Anyway, in this lecture, I'm going to talk about the concept of othering and exchange of lenses, how to see the world from different places is a very necessary exercise for journalists. And I'll also weave in some histories largely forgotten. And I'm going to talk also a little bit about global crisis and focus mainly on war and refugees and the challenges they pose to journalism, as well as the challenges that are posed by digital media, social media, for journalists and other truth seekers. You see here an illustration to make my point that the world looks different according to where you are. This is a painting called Nuestra Norte es el Sur, our north is the south. I mean, why are we so used to seeing the world upside down? So, seeing the world exchanging lenses, I'll come back to maybe some more serious issues, but Norway and Russia, they share a border. You're aware of that, I'm sure. And I've been to that border. My husband used to be, when he was in the military service, he had his service up there by the border with Russia. But first, some other experiences that I have. I've lived in Peshawar, Pakistan, near the Afghan border for almost 2 years, during the Soviet-Afghan war. And of course, my reporting from there was strongly influenced by what I saw, which were the refugees coming out of the country. And I won't go into all that. But I'll say also that years after the dissolvement of the Soviet Union, I went to Tallinn in Estonia, and I met with a journalist there from Russia who said that, you know, during that war, I was in Kabul, and I was made to sit on a cannon, and I was posing for pictures and all. And she told her experiences. And of course, that taught me also a lesson. Another lesson was when I went to Sevastopol and saw the graves of the young soldiers who had died in Afghanistan at the age of 18 and 19. I had seen the soldiers from the other side dying, and I heard about the losses of several families. Now this knowledge was supplemented by traveling to another place. The picture you see on top is about refugees. Particularly 2 years ago, a lot of refugees came across the border, and to be allowed over the border, they all had to come by bicycle for some reason. I won't go into that, but it's just another experience that we shared. Third one is now the Norwegian media full of issues about the forthcoming Olympics and the just or unjust treatment of the Russian ski athletes. And not the least, rather recently, like I think 8 weeks ago, a Norwegian traveler or a spy was arrested by the German authorities. In Norway, as you can see by the lower picture to the left, there are demonstrations in the town bordering on the Russian border, saying he should be freed, he's innocent. In Russia, he sits now in a court and is accused of being a spy. So there are, of course, different versions between the two countries of ours. I won't say more about it, just so you see, we share something, but there are various stories, various narratives. And then again, the challenge to journalism, are we able to see the world through different lenses and even simultaneously? Is that even a possibility? Or is that a too lofty ambition? I repeat a picture that I've shown to some of you before, those of you who organized the conference at least, but to me that was revealing. I grew up with a mother who gave me the book of Florence Nightingale, the nurse who was engaged in nursing the patients of the Crimea War, well, of course, the patients on the British side. And then I came to the museum in Sevastopol, which is a 360-degree museum, some of you might have seen it, about one scene from the battles, the battleground at the Crimean War. And there I learned of the Russian Florence Nightingale, and her name was Daria Lavrentievna Mikhailova. So there was another narrative again. So we learn about the one, you learn about the other. Maybe we should learn about each other's humanitarian people in the history. So what is this othering that is so much, we could call it a disease, or we could call it a natural instinct, we could call it many things. I think it's natural and it's simple to say that I am unlike you, you are different from me. That is simple, that is innocent, but then there is the hierarchical exercise helped by prejudice and also by the history of colonialism and war. Those mechanisms render people worthless or of lesser value than a presupposed we. And it increases simultaneously the vulnerability of the other. The picture you see on top here is from how the clerical people would chase away the lepers. In Europe, you had a lot of people suffering from leprosy in the past. And the other one you can understand, I'm sure. Othering can be based on looking down upon others' nationalities, ethnicity, social class, gender, sexuality, disability, or religion. And in journalism, how do we cope with this? Do we place more emphasis on the differences or the likenesses of people? I think this touches upon a topic you've already treated here, namely universalism. But journalists that I've interviewed said that differences is so much more exciting than likeness. My own experience is the opposite, that to find likeness in very remote places, very far from the Norwegian small and very advanced civilization, to find likenesses there is as exciting. But if you focus only on differences, you might also be a tool of polarization between people, in my opinion. And then there is the issue of the other woman. I mean, we know today that Samuel Huntington, he had this book about the clash of civilizations, and the main civilization clash would be between the Western world and the Muslim world. Maybe the interpreters, you can translate what's said here. The bikini-clad woman says, everything covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. And the other one says, nothing covered but her eyes, what a cruel male-dominated culture. So this is maybe also to speak a little bit about the way in which we are othering each other. So briefly, these are some of the challenges that we face today in this world: climate change, extreme weather, wars, transnational terror, and also state terror, by the way. Migration, today we have more than 65 million refugees. Financial crisis, trade wars, and the information revolution, and we live in the age of speed, enormous speed. As a person who grew up with a manual typewriter, it's hard to adjust to this speed, but I think both me and the others my age, we try our best. And then there is also news media losing confidence due to many reasons, one of them maybe also being the social media influence. Just, I'll mention climate very briefly, since this is something we share, being close to the Arctic, where we know that the temperature rises more dramatically. We know that the Arctic could be free of ice by 2040. We don't know for sure. And the whole world would be affected by this. And the paradox is that the media are enthusiastic about all the new trade routes. And on the other hand, there is the issue of not using all these routes, because that would enhance the climate change even more. In journalism communication, there is a challenge. Should we concentrate more on the catastrophic future perspectives, or should we be solution-oriented. And then again, you see in one Norwegian newspapers, you would see on the business pages, hooray, we found more oil. And on other pages, you see 2/3 of our oil should be left in the ground to help climate change not deteriorating. So the press is schizophrenic on the issue. To war. Is there a chance for peace journalism? In my institution, we've taught war and peace journalism for many, many years. And we have critiqued journalism that focuses only on terror and violence, and not too much on dialogue, human compassion, and resilience. I've chosen this picture. One is from Iraq, from 2003. It's a father comforting his son being interned by the US. The other one is not actually about war, but it's an earthquake, and it's a Norwegian photographer who sees how human resilience can be there even in a situation where the whole town is devastated by an earthquake. Barbers have continued their business. So to me, it's a symbol of human capacity, actually, both of these pictures in different ways. There was a talk yesterday evening about sweeping generalizations, or glittering generalization, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to oppose that via multi-causal explanations of terrorism. The causes of terrorism are manifold. Some would say simply that it's these Islamic extremists, and that's all there is to it. But of course, the war and the conflict situation and oppression is an issue. The lack of opportunity, poverty, and recruitment, and there are recruiters. Extremist religious streams, of course, plays a role. Humiliation, lack of recognition. I think these pictures from the Abu Ghraib prison in Baghdad from 2003, made by then rather primitive cell phones, they illustrate humiliation. And then it was journalists who published Abu Ghraib images, one of them being Seymour Hersh, who was also famous for revealing some of the issues of the Vietnam War way back in the 60s. And later, of course, these pictures were spread by social media and were used for particular issues. We should not ignore that. And that leads me to a former student of mine, Afshin, who is from Kurdistan himself, who has revealed through his own studies of social media recruitment how the ISIS, or Daesh, as it's called in the Arab world, how they recruit via social media. One of them, you see the bottom picture, he actually says that, look what we have in our shops. And he's talking about inside the ISIS Raqqa. We have this nice spread for the bread we have, and we have all this other merchandise. When he sums up how the social media mobilization goes on to terrorism, he says it's religious instruction with sort of enticing music. It's military training. It's also reporting from the battlefield. It's the interpersonal communication between people who want to recruit people they know in their home countries. This is even better than the Call of Duty or Grand Theft Auto, these video games that many young people play. Everyday life is reported, and also threats against the West, and of course the West being the demon. So all this he sums up as he has seen in the ISIS social pages. So then the journalist's dilemma in this case is, do we give these people a platform through the coverage? To which extent and how? I think nobody has found the super solution to this. And they get a lot of coverage, but is this coverage solution-oriented? Is it frightening? Is it to some people even enticing? So then I come to the refugee crisis, and it's been called by a Bulgarian writer who recently published a book after Europe, Ivan Krastev. He calls the refugee crisis as Europe's 9/11. He says it became Europe's 9/11 because it fundamentally changed the Europeans' idea about Europe, about the world, and about Europe's place in the world. He says that the dream of EU universalism with open borders, soft power, human rights, free trade and welfare for all, that dream is gone, he says. And why is it gone? I think one of the reasons it's gone is because you see increasingly hostility towards, replacing humanitarianism towards the refugees. I came back from Beirut, Lebanon, on Monday. Lebanon is a small country, a bit bigger than Wales, I gather, and they have between 1 and 2 million Syrian refugees within their borders. And in our countries, in my country, we're discussing whether we should take 1,000 or 2,000. So then, and today's paper in Norway, one of the major papers, I just read it before I came back here, there is a main headline saying that politicians in one of the richest countries have lost their compassion because now they deport Afghan refugees to a country which has virtually no guaranteed security. So what does journalism do when they face this crisis? Do they promote universalism at another level, which if this universalism is gone, through exchange of lenses? And Lena reminded me this morning that actually Russia has today said that they will withdraw the funds for the European Council, which will mean, as I understand it, you'll have to correct me in the discussion, that you would no longer have the access to the European Court, which means a lot to many of us, also to Norway. But I think it's more important for Russia. So the migration, very quickly, 86% of all refugees were taken in by low and middle income countries, not including then Western European countries particularly. And the internally displaced persons represent a large proportion, as you can see. Those are the white-colored ones. And journalists here face both political pressures of having a harsh migration policy, but they also face from NGOs and people sympathetic to refugees humanitarian pressures. And then again, how to navigate between polarization and humanitarian approaches. Again, a great challenge to journalism. I want to travel back in history. I noticed yesterday you had 4 symbols for journalism, and the one you didn't touch upon was the rear view mirror. So I found the rear view mirror here, and that leads me back in history. Because I think, as has been said by some of the quotes that you have put in the program, if we are without history, then basically we will not be able to navigate as journalists. And I want to put to your attention the Evian conference, which took part in 1938 in France, and where global leaders, world leaders, met to discuss the problem of Jewish refugees. It should be well known by then, but Jews were in peril in Germany and Austria. But still, most of these world leaders refused to accept Jewish refugees. In Brazil, they would say that they only accepted those who converted to Christianity. In Canada, they would only accept agricultural laborers. In UK, they only wanted children, and you know that quite a few children from Austria and Germany came to UK without their parents, actually. Switzerland feared being flooded by Jews and wouldn't accept them. In the US, they needed, believe me, they needed a certificate of good behavior from the German police. You can imagine how easy that was to get in 1938. Norway were they feared having 18 children who were supposed to come for a summer holiday because they might be stuck with them. I think it's a very shameful thing to remember. The one country that really showed some compassion here was actually Dominican Republic. They said they could take quite a few. But to remember this history, it has been very little about it in the encyclopedias. It's been very little about them in books. But there is a book now out in 2018 about the Evian Conference of 1938. I think I would really like to read it to learn more. I learned about the Evian Conference from a Jewish friend of mine in Norway for the first time just last year. There are other parts of history. It's not only about Jews, it's also about Roma people or Gypsies who were denied access to Norway where they had lived before in 1934, stopped by the border and between Denmark and Germany, and later 2/3 of them died in concentration camps. So there are many historical examples that we should be aware of. I'm not talking about historical parallels. That is always very hard. But I'm talking about lessons we need to learn. So back to today. Refugees, many, are living in a so-called no man's land. This is Zygmunt Bauman's word for it. And for many, it becomes a lasting experience. as with the tens, hundreds of thousands of refugees living in tents in the Bekaa Valley in Lebanon with freezing temperatures. So how do they survive in these no man's land or on the way to Europe? I did a small research project together with two of my students and on how they use the smartphones, and then again social media such as Facebook, Telegram, Twitter, whatnot, to survive on the way. While I could take a plane from Turkey to Norway in 4 hours, they would use 30 days for the journey. And of course, on the way, they need to use these modern devices. It makes life easier for them. And the route of flight, we know, I'll just go very quickly through it. Wars, armed conflicts, political oppression, religious persecution, vulnerable minority status, climate change is also becoming an issue, although climate refugees are not yet recognized by the UN. Poverty, unemployment, lack of future prospects, and risk is underway. Smugglers can be deadly. And so how would news journalism focus on this? They often focus much on conflict and drama, but neglect maybe all these causes that give a reason to people to flee. So then to conflict and social media. In Tunisia, we know by the revolution in 2011, which is not leaving such a great legacy nowadays, but it was a social media revolution. I was there just 3 months after the revolution, and although I don't understand Arabic, the word Facebook came through the Arabic words that I listened to. And one of the main bloggers was the so-called Tunisian girl. In Egypt, you also saw, many say it was more of an Al Jazeera revolution, but still there were social media both functioning to unite people, but also later to divide people now after Mubarak, after Morsi, dividing Salafis, Copt, Christians, Muslim Brotherhood against each other. So social media can be both unifying for a cause, and they can be very divisive. In Gaza 2014, you had another issue, Farah Baker, who started tweeting. She was 16 years old, and there was bombing going on, and she wrote, "I am Farah Baker, Gazan girl, 16 years old. Since I was born, I have survived 3 wars, and I think this is enough." She started modestly with stories and photos, but during a few weeks, her tweets were read from 800 only to 200,000 followers she had, and she had hundreds of retweets. So this also shows the power of social media. And the latest post she had was 3 days ago, I just checked. So this is one voice, but a one voice can be pretty powerful, and then you can say, what is she? How do we define her? Is she a citizen journalist? Or is this a propaganda campaign, world seen from one place? Well, we have problems sometimes defining what is journalism these days, and I know we're going to have an evening session on it, so I look very much forward to that. But then a little bit about political communication and social media. Here are 2 rather famous figures. The one is now ousted for corruption, that is the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif. Journalists in Pakistan complained that he was using tweets much to communicate instead of having press conferences where they could ask him, confront him, question his politics. It seems Donald Trump rules the same way, and he's still in office, as you know. All these voices that we see make us maybe sometimes think we live in an age of manipulation and disinformation. I recently read a report from an institution called Data and Society called precisely this, Media Manipulation and Disinformation Online. And some of its main conclusions are that internet subcultures take advantage of the current media ecosystem to manipulate news frames, set agendas, and propagate ideas. We know that social media are penetrating the traditional media, that the traditional media quote them, and when they see that there's a storm on social media, they have to react. I'll show some examples of that. The traditional media are vulnerable to this manipulation, and this might also, in cases when they believe untruths, lead to increased distrust in mainstream media, and more misinformation and further radicalization of groups in society. Some examples here, and I know some of them might not be true. It's hard to trust anybody these days. But the first is the Pizzagate example with Hillary Clinton. If that's been mentioned before here, there were social media reports that she ran a pedophile ring concentrated on one pizza shop in New York. And this came so far that one man went into that shop with a gun and threatened and wounded a person in there. Those people initiating this were right-wing Trump supporters. Then there was another one by very right-wing racial people in the US, said that they had created a white student union. This white student union never existed. It was fake. But it was picked up by mainstream media as a truth, by the USA Today, for example. Then there's something I read in this book by David Patriakakos called War in 140 Characters, saying that there was a St. Petersburg troll farm and that one reporter, former reporter Vitaly Bespilov, was recruited to this to rewrite articles, to conquer the social media with false information about Ukraine. I don't know if it's a true story or not. Maybe some of you from St. Petersburg would know more about this, and I would be glad to hear your response. I think the conclusion here is that fake news and propaganda may change the thinking of people, their perception of the world. But also, for those who will not rely on this fake news, it would still change the agenda, the news agenda. So there's media manipulation on two levels. And for journalism, there's just one thing to say about it, that increased awareness has to be there. And that is not easy. You have to have a very high degree of social media literacy to deal with this. In some countries, I've recently spoken to colleagues of mine from Bangladesh, saying that in our case, some people go directly from illiteracy and learning to read and write and then to cell phone technology, where they have no tools to distinguish between false truths, between propaganda, between fake news, and traditional media. They would all be feeding into the same cell phone. That is a new invention for them. And then, of course, there is the way in which the Me Too campaign, which I'm sure you've heard of, although I know it's not very much present in the countries present here. But in Norway it was, and in US it was, and in many European countries it's been. It started in social media and became mainstream. And in Norway it has so far actually deposed 3 leading politicians who have acted in a very indecent way towards younger women. One from Social Democrats, one from a populist, very right-wing party, and one from the Conservative Party. And there might be more to come. And then there are other issues which are not Me Too, actually. But there was a story, and I can tell it here because it's out in all the Norwegian media. It started in a fringe, very right-wing website, which is not really medium as such, not a journalistic medium anyway. It's a website. They told a story about the leader of the Liberal Party having, when she was 38 years old, having had sex during a wedding party with a 17-year-old boy. It turned out that this was a true story, but that had been no coercion from either side. The boy had not forced the woman had not forced the boy, they were both drunk. So some of the legacy media, the traditional media, did not want to print this story, but it became so powerful on social media that in the end, the largest newspaper of Norway brought this party leader, female party leader, now 10 years older, who is now a minister of culture in our current government, to the front page to say that, well, I've done stupid things, but I'm not an abuser. So that's also how fringe media then feed into social media and then feed into traditional media. And we can only dream of what more important causes have been sidelined by these causes. So journalism, how should it deal? Well, they included in Norway the campaign of Me Too, for example, and were hunting the oppressive men very much. But simultaneously, a debate on ethics came out, not least when this party leader issue came about, which was not a Me Too thing. But they did not debate so much how these causes sidelined other important and vital causes, international issues, more important political issues. So how about free expression and hate speech? I think this has been, in my country, a very vital issue. I should tell you also, I'm a vice president of Norwegian PEN, a writers' and freedom of expression NGO, which is widespread across the world. I know it has chapters in Russia as well, and in Ukraine. Some of the chapters are well-functioning, others are rather anonymous and very elitist. Anyway, we've discussed this much in Norwegian Pen. How do we deal with the widespread hate speech against minorities, whether they are religious, whether they are ethnic, whether they are sexual? How do we deal with hate speech towards refugees and women? There's a media paradox here, which is hard to grapple with, I'd say, because it's very clear, and it's been demonstrated many times, that widespread hate speech, particularly when it targets individuals, limits others' rights to free speech. That is a dilemma. I'm not saying we should curb free speech due to this, but I'm saying it is a dilemma. I've seen young Muslim women being quiet for 3 years because after they won a certain award, they would be so much harassed on social media and with death threats at that they would withdraw from any media at all. That's happened. And then, of course, there is what's happening in Europe now. Very, very recently, we've seen that there are new laws in the pipeline about free expression and also new laws against net harassment and false news. In Germany, this year, actually very, very recently, a law has been introduced that demands social media sites to move quickly to remove hate speech, fake news, and illegal material. This law is, of course, controversial. Reporters Sans Frontières, Reporters Without Borders, have reacted against it. Emmanuel Macron in France, he has proposed a new law against news as lies, which means basically fake news. And there, Reporters Without Borders have surprisingly acted differently and been sympathetic to his proposition, while the major liberal critical newspaper Le Monde is highly critical of Macron's proposition. So you can say that the press and journalists are in doubt about these laws, at least in Western Europe. That's, of course, interesting to discuss. So I'm heading towards the end, and I'm not bad on time, I think. A little bit about social media and social media literacy. As I said, there is this social media literacy coming from illiteracy, and there is the fake news and history of propaganda. The 2003 weapons of mass destruction story is an issue here. And I think, what is the difference between that and fake news today? Is there any difference? Are we just calling propaganda with a new name? And I was in a conference last year where the whole concept of fake news was actually discussed. I mean, when we say fake news, isn't that a contradictory term? Because news is supposed to be true. I mean, news is about something that's happening. It's not about something that's not happening. So maybe fake news as an issue is something that Trump likes very much. Why should we like it as much as him? I'm just wondering. So now I think in 2017, compared to when we had the weapons of mass destruction fake story or propaganda, there is an increased dependency on social media. And we see, at least in my country, a gradual outsourcing of editorship, which means that one of the largest newspapers, for example, they no longer have the comment fields within their own website. They've outsourced them to Facebook. So the debate for this newspaper goes on Facebook. Is that a problem? I think so. And the reason that is a problem is a very recent news. I read it only yesterday in The Guardian. That is a columnist, Emily Bell. She wrote the following. Last week, Facebook announced that it was changing its recipe for the news feed, the stream of posts anyone sees when they open up their account, and that the net effect would be to promote more things posted by family and friends and fewer things produced by publishers. Which means again that the Facebook traffic referrals to publishers were sharply down. Does this mean more cat videos and less foreign news? More about, yes, now I am a tourist in Paris, and less about demonstrations going on in Paris? Could be. And there was another entry that this article in The Guardian referred to from a Serbian editor from July last year who noticed already this tendency happening then. He says, "Last month, I noticed that our stories had stopped appearing on Facebook as usual. I was stunned. Our largest single source of traffic, accounting for more than half of our monthly page views, had been crippled." So, the conclusion of Emily Bell was, should journalists who have outsourced so much to the social media, which, as we know at least in our country and adjacent countries, they take the main ad revenue, they steal it from us, so to say, should journalism still move back to their own websites and go away from the social media when it comes to news publishing? That's an issue to be discussed. Finally, Transnational Navigation, which was part of my title for today. Social media literacy is required. I will not have a full list of what that entails, but at least it entails an ongoing critical source evaluation, and that has to be strengthened because we are overflooded with information now. I remember a time when we were not. Some of you who have come of age also do remember that. Who speaks, as you did very well yesterday. I was so amazed to see the way in which you analyzed who speaks, to what public, what kind of character is this, etc. It was really a learning process for me to listen to how you analyze this. So I think the ability from this training will at least speak to social media literacy. And then again, to know the social media conglomerates, their business models, how they make their money, how their routines and mechanisms function, how their algorithms, in short, function. And then, of course, the fake news watchdogs. In Norway, 2 years ago, I think it's now, 1.5 years ago, something called Faktisk.no, which is factcheck.no, was created, where several media, including the public broadcasting, joined hands to have a special website to monitor facticity of the news in a wide range of media. And it's also a member of the International Fact Check News Network. I don't know if any of you are members of the same, or whether it's interesting for you to be. And of course, what they do is to identify what is the fake news or propaganda. But what we also need to do, which is not a task of this institution, is to identify what is backgrounded, what is not there, due to maybe the way in which social media and the clickification of our own website, how they generate some stories and close or background other stories. So sometimes very trivial news get top scores click-wise, and they will be then highlighted. I know one of the largest newspapers in Norway, the columnists, external columnists, they are paid according to how many clicks they have. I mean, they're paid for the columns according to clickification, that I call it. Last but not least, people need to know the principles and dilemmas of free expression. Not to curb free expression, far from, but to know that if the propagandists and the fakers out there are not met resolutely by true stories, truthful approaches, there will be more. And it will seep into the legacy media, which again means that the trust of media will be less. In country after country, we see polls saying that the distrust of media, the traditional media, is increasing. And in the US, it's very clear. So there was a challenge yesterday of an oath put forward by the moderators up here. I don't know if I have a good proposition, but at least the conclusion of mine would be that to the extent that the trust is lost with the traditional media and with journalism as a profession, we need to gain more trust, regain trust through continuous accuracy, fairness, and human decency. Thank you so far.